The 22nd of January 1943. Voronezh Front, Western Russia. Dawn had not yet broken, but the ground already glowed faintly with a low, orange smear of distant fires. Snow shifted in thin sheets across the frozen steppe, dragged by a wind so sharp it hummed through the gaps of gutted birch trees. Beneath that wind came another sound, heavy, layered, metallic. Dozens of Soviet T-34s idled nose to tail, engines rumbling like trapped animals waiting to be released. Frost clung to their armor, steam drifted from exhaust stacks, and the faint clatter of wrenches echoed as crews made their final checks in the half-dark. Inside a small field bunker carved into a shallow ridge, Soviet engineers studied reconnaissance maps under an oil lamp that hissed every few seconds. The air smelled of diesel, wet wool, and cold metal. Their breath fogged in the near-freezing room. Outside, the tanks were lining up for a breakthrough operation meant to punch a corridor through the weak seam of the German line. At least, that's what Soviet command believed. The engineers had spent hours examining the terrain, marking weak ground, frozen rivers, and expected points of resistance. Every detail mattered. One mistake could jam the entire armored column into an immovable traffic knot. The tension sat thick and unmoving, like the weight of the frozen earth above them. A courier burst through the bunker curtain, boots thumping, the flap swinging behind him and letting in a bite of cold. A single sentence was delivered, quiet, clipped, but urgent enough that the engineers instantly leaned over the table. German aircraft activity had been reported somewhere west of their intended line of advance. Not uncommon. Not alarming. Not enough to halt a column of this size. Still, the senior engineer felt something sharpening in his chest. He stepped outside, snow crunching under his boots. The eastern sky was turning from black to a bruised purple, and the silhouettes of the tank crews moved through the haze like ghosts preparing for a ritual. Engines revved, tracks clinked, and exhaust smoke dispersed in thin, restless spirals. What none of them sensed yet, what none of them were meant to sense, was the faint, distant growl beyond the horizon. A growl hidden inside the wind. Low at first. Too low to distinguish from the ambient noise of the front. A vibration more than a sound. The engineers continued their checks, unaware that German forward observers had already marked the massing formation. They did not know that miles away, on a frozen airstrip behind the German lines, several Focke-Wulf Fw-190 fighter bombers had been warming their engines since before midnight. They did not know that the Luftwaffe had redirected a rapid response Schlachtgruppe specializing in low-level tank strikes. The Soviet planners expected Messerschmitt's hunting supply trucks, not armored ground attack fighters built to tear through steel. The sound grew closer, still unnoticed. It rode the wind in pulses, blending with the rumble of T-34 engines until the two layers fused into one indistinct vibration across the open steppe. The engineers checked fuel lines. Gunners inspected ammunition belts. Commanders shouted orders as the first line of tanks began to move, their tracks dragging deep grooves in the icy soil. Then came a shift in the air. Light trembled on the metal surfaces. A faint strobe flickered across the snow, gone almost instantly. Another flash followed, sharper this time, cutting across the white field like a fleeting silver blade. The senior engineer froze, eyes narrowing as he looked west. Something moved against the horizon. Not smoke. Not birds. The radio on the closest tank crackled sharply. A short burst, half static. Then a strained voice. Air, incoming, low. Very low. Crews jerked their heads upward. Mechanics stepped back from the armor. Commanders climbed halfway out of their hatches, scanning the faint lightening sky. The wind carried it now. Clear. Heavy. Fast. The roar hit like a sudden tear in the atmosphere, a ripping, mechanical thunder that trembled through the ground and into the bones of every man in the column. Snow leapt from the earth in thin sheets as pressure waves rippled through the frozen field. The Fw-190s came in barely above treetop height, silhouettes cutting through the dim morning haze like dark, predatory blades. The first wave angled its wings slightly, sunlight glancing off the armored engine cowls. The Soviet crews barely had seconds to register what they were seeing. The engineers felt their stomachs drop. They had expected German artillery or a scattered Stuka run on rear positions. Not this. Not fast, armored fighter bombers perfectly timed with their most vulnerable moment, when the tanks were bunched, idling, half-prepared, and fully exposed. The first aircraft released its ordnance at a slant, bombs tracking low across the snow with a shrill rising whistle that cut through the rumble of engines. The engineers ducked instinctively as the first explosion tore into the earth near the column's left flank. Fire erupted upward in a geyser of dirt, steel fragments, and snow. The blast wave slammed against the bunker walls, rattling every loose bolt. Another whistle. Another detonation. The attacks grew faster, closer, more precise. Multiple Fw-190s were now sweeping across the formation. Tracer rounds stitched the snow, ricocheting off hulls, clattering like hail against armor. Tank crews scrambled into their vehicles as machine gun fire shredded the open ground. Heat rolled across the field. Smoke thickened. Flame reflected in the frost, creating a surreal glow that flickered across the engineers' faces. But the worst had not yet begun. Because the Fw-190s were not striking to scatter. They were striking to annihilate. And the Soviet engineers, still outside, still exposed, still trying to coordinate a column that was unraveling into chaos, were about to watch something they had never seen before. Something that felt impossible. Something they could not stop. The first moments of the attack shattered the disciplined rhythm of the Soviet armored column. Tank engines roared as commanders slammed their hatches shut, but many gunners were still outside when the next wave of fighter bombers streaked across the frozen plain. The Fw-190s moved like predatory shapes skimming the earth, their radial engines thundering low enough that the ground itself vibrated. Snow streamed behind their wingtips in sharp, parallel wakes. The Soviet engineers crouched behind a berm as a second aircraft released a cluster of low-drag bombs. They struck in a tight line, each detonation flickering in a chain that rolled through the snow like a moving furnace. Heat punched outward in bursts, slamming against tank hulls and sending shockwaves through the air heavy with diesel fumes and freezing mist. One T-34 rocked violently, its tracks lifting partially from the ground as the nearest blast crater heaved beneath it. Smoke rose in twisting black columns. Firelight flickered against the low morning haze. The German aircraft curved around the far side of the column in a wide arc, staying low, always low, and repositioning with lethal precision. They weren't probing. They weren't harassing. They were executing a prepared strike against a formation too dense, too exposed, and too slow to respond. The senior engineer attempted to reach battalion command on the field wire, but the line crackled dead, overwhelmed by interference and structural damage from the first bomb wave. He ran toward the nearest tank, boots slipping on the frosted earth, as another thunderous pass cut overhead. The Fw-190s opened fire with their outboard cannons, each round ripping the air with a high-frequency hiss, then hammering against steel armor with sparks like molten needles. Break formation. Disperse, north tree line. A commander barked over the radio in frantic bursts, his voice crushed between static and engine rumble. Tanks lurched forward, tracks grinding, engines groaning. But the Fw-190s had anticipated this. As the column attempted to stretch and maneuver, the next pair came in directly across the line of escape, strafing low enough that the sound of their engines drowned out every other noise. Tracer fire cut horizontal paths of burning orange through the snow. Shells tore into exposed supply trucks at the rear of the formation, igniting oil drums that erupted into towering jets of flame. The heat rolled outward in waves, melting channels through the frost. The flames reflected on the sides of nearby T-34s, turning their green armor into glowing silhouettes. Smoke began to flood the low ground, thick and oily, settling into the shallow trenches and clinging to the earth like a creeping fog. On the ridge above them, the first light of sunrise finally broke through the haze, illuminating the wings of an incoming Fw-190 in a glinting, metallic flash. It leveled out, skimming so close to the ground that its shadow raced ahead of it like a black blade across the snow. The pilot released a single bomb with perfect timing. It struck just ahead of the advancing tanks with a blast that threw a curtain of fiery debris into the air. Inside the lead T-34, the gunner braced as the shockwave slammed through the hull. His periscope jarred violently, the image blurring into chaotic streaks of fire and shadow. He swung the turret toward the retreating aircraft, but the angle was hopeless. The Germans never flew high enough for a clean shot. The engineers tried to organize an emergency spread pattern, waving their arms, signaling drivers through the smoke. But another pass forced them to dive into the snow as cannon rounds ripped apart the ground around them. A cascade of soil, ice, and shrapnel showered the ridge, sending a sharp metallic rattle through the bunker remains. A truck near the center of the formation erupted into a bloom of flame as its fuel tanks ignited, the explosion sending a shockwave that made the air shudder. The blast toppled two nearby infantrymen and sent a rolling plume of black smoke spiraling upward. The engineers watched in horror as the column's cohesion dissolved. What had been an organized armored thrust minutes earlier was now a scattering, burning mass of steel and men clawing for any cover the flat terrain could offer. A radio operator inside one of the tanks shouted a broken call through static. Multiple, aircraft, south, regroup, can't. The transmission collapsed into a burst of white noise. The FW-190s wheeled around again, their silhouettes momentarily vanishing into the thickening smoke before emerging on the opposite side with terrifying clarity. They dove as a synchronized unit. The engines whined at the edge of their mechanical limits, and the shriek of incoming ordnance sliced through the freezing air. Explosions erupted in rapid succession, each one illuminating the smoke from within like lightning trapped in a storm cloud. The ground shook violently beneath the engineers. A T-34 near the front of the column caught a direct hit, a fireball swallowing its turret in an eruption of molten metal and black smoke. The vehicle rocked once, then lay still, flames pouring from the torn engine deck. The senior engineer felt the icy wind whip across his face as he crawled behind the wreckage of a supply sled. The snow vibrated under him from the relentless strafing runs. He could see now the terrifying rhythm of the attack. The Germans were using timing, angles, and the natural funnels of the terrain to trap the Soviet tanks into predictable escape patterns. Each attempt to maneuver only exposed them more. The air filled with the roar of engines, the hiss of cannon fire, the crackling of burning fuel, and the distant, rolling thunder of more explosions. Shadows flickered across the ground as German aircraft banked and circled, their wings cutting through the smoke like scythes. And still, the assault escalated. Because the next wave of FW-190s wasn't coming to disrupt. They were coming to finish the job. The smoke rolled across the steppe in churning layers, thick enough to swallow whole vehicles and turn the battlefield into a shifting labyrinth of black silhouettes. Flames carved pockets of orange inside the darkness, flickering across shattered debris and mangled steel. The FW-190s emerged through this haze like predatory shapes breaking from a storm cloud, fast, abrupt, and impossibly low. Their engines hammered the air with a mechanical force so deep it vibrated through the frozen earth. The Soviet armored column, once a unified spear point aimed at the German line, had fractured into scattered knots of tanks trying to claw their way out of the kill zone. Some twisted through the smoke blindly, engines screaming as drivers pushed them to their limits. Others sat immobilized, crippled by bomb blasts or track damage, their crews trapped inside shrinking cages of heat and metal. The first aircraft of the next wave descended with a sharp roll, cutting across the battlefield at an angle no Soviet gunner had a chance of tracking. The pilot released a pair of 50 kilograms bombs that tumbled low, trailing arcs of thick white smoke. They struck the ground beneath the lead group of retreating tanks and detonated with a thunderous, concussive roar that lifted sheets of snow into a towering plume. Fire ripped outward, engulfing the nearest vehicles in a blast of orange and steel. One T-34, caught at the edge of the explosion, reeled sideways and crashed into a frozen ditch. Its turret hatch flew open, smoke pouring from the interior as the crew tried to escape. The second engineer on the ridge saw them crawl out into the burning snow, their silhouettes swallowed by black smoke as cannon fire stitched the ground around them. Another FW-190 dropped into the smoke layer so low its propeller wash flattened the snow in a circular blast beneath it. Its nose guns opened up in a blinding stream of tracer fire, the rounds hammering against a line of tanks trying to reverse toward a shallow depression. Sparks leapt in frenzied cascades as shells tore across armor plating. A fuel line ruptured. Flames ignited instantly, rolling upward in a wave that illuminated the battlefield in a hellish glare. Inside a surviving T-34, the commander tried to track the aircraft through a periscope smeared with soot and frost. Every time he adjusted, the silhouette vanished behind another wall of smoke or shot past too quickly for a stable aim point. The FW-190s were not operating like dive bombers or high-level attackers. They behaved like hunters in a controlled, rehearsed pattern, circling, cutting in, striking from angles that left the tanks constantly exposed. The Germans had mastered the terrain, the timing, the psychology. The Soviet crews were trapped inside a collapsing maze of fire and ground-shaking detonations. A new threat entered the battlefield, heavy cannon shells from 190s fitted for anti-armor strikes. The sound they made slicing through the air was different, deeper, sharper, more violent. A series of rapid thuds followed as 20mm rounds punched through a soft-skinned ammunition truck. The vehicle erupted in a chain reaction, the blast so powerful that it ripped open the rear section of the tank column and sent a wave of fire roaring across the snow. The senior engineer shielded his face as superheated air surged across the ridge, carrying with it embers, soil, and fragments of burning canvas. He turned his head away from the heat, only to glimpse another aircraft dropping from the smoke layer directly overhead. The FW-190 banked sharply, revealing the underside of its wings, dark, angular shapes flickering through the haze. Its shadow swept across the ground like a moving blade. A brief, clipped radio call broke through the static. More, incoming, 30 seconds, from south. But the call wasn't warning of German aircraft. It was warning of the inevitable collapse. As the next two Fw-190s swooped in from the south, the tank crews finally attempted something desperate: coordinated movement. Drivers pushed their vehicles into a staggered, spreading pattern designed to break the predictability the attackers had exploited. Engines roared as treads tore into the frozen soil. Tanks veered to the right, then cut sharply left, trying to throw off the Germans' line of sight. It almost worked. The aircraft overshot by a fraction, their bombs detonating behind the new formation instead of inside it. A momentary gap opened, a narrow, fragile window where the tanks actually gained ground. But it lasted 3 seconds. The next pair of Fw-190s appeared in a synchronized sweep, rolling their wings in unison as they descended into the path of the escaping vehicles. Their engines screamed as they throttled forward, closing the distance at terrifying speed. The Soviet gunners opened fire with desperate bursts from their machine guns, but the rounds streaked harmlessly into the haze, never touching the armored aircraft. The Germans fired into the mass of moving tanks with precise, rhythmic bursts. Cannon shells tore through the columns, ripping open engine decks and shattering track assemblies. One tank lurched sideways, a wheel blown completely free, the mangled track unraveling behind it like a torn ribbon. Another took a direct hit to its rear armor and erupted in a violent explosion that sent debris scattering across the snowfield. The battlefield now resembled a vast, burning corridor, a tunnel of flame, smoke, and collapsing steel. The air was filled with the roar of radial engines slicing overhead, the deep booms of bombs detonating in rapid succession, and the piercing hiss of tracer fire ripping through the haze. Visibility shrank to a few meters at a time as smoke thickened into suffocating black curtains that swallowed entire vehicles. The senior engineer crawled through the wreckage, disoriented but driven by instinct to reach any surviving command post. The ground trembled beneath him as another wave of ordnance struck the far end of the column. He could feel each explosion as a violent pressure in his chest, pushing the air from his lungs. The ridgeline behind them shook with such force that loose earth trickled down in thin sheets. A final pass began, a coordinated strike by 4 Fw-190s flying in a tight, lethal formation. They descended into the kill zone in perfect sequence, one after another, their wings slicing through the smoke as they released their final loads. Fire erupted along the entire length of the column. The tanks, the trucks, the support vehicles, all were caught in a cascading line of explosions that merged into a single, rolling wave of flame and thunder. The snow melted in wide circles around each blast. The ground shook. The air turned molten. And in that moment, the Soviet engineers finally understood the truth behind the German reputation whispered across the front. This wasn't a raid. This was an execution. The last echoes of the bombardment drifted over the steppe like the dying rumble of distant thunder. Smoke wrapped the field in a suffocating shroud, rising in slow, unsteady columns that twisted upward before dissolving into the pale winter sky. The roar of engines faded into the distance as the final wave of Fw-190s banked north, disappearing beyond a veil of haze and sunlight. Their departure left behind a battlefield so quiet it felt unnatural, a sudden emptiness after an hour of mechanical fury. The senior engineer pushed himself upright, coughing hard as soot scraped the back of his throat. The air tasted of burnt oil, scorched rubber, and metal vapor. Every breath carried the residue of fire. He leaned against a twisted section of track, its steel still warm, and stared into the smoke as the shapes around him began to emerge. Wrecks half buried in snow, shattered hulls caved in by explosions, turrets peeled open like crushed tin. The armored column no longer resembled a military force. It looked like a graveyard of machines, frozen in the positions where they died. He staggered forward, boots sinking into ash-softened snow. Each step crunched on shattered glass, ruptured casings, and fragments of steel that glowed faintly from heat. The silence pressed against him with the weight of something enormous. Even the wind seemed muted as it curled around the burnt-out hulks, carrying with it long, thin trails of smoke. Somewhere ahead, an engine sputtered weakly, a wounded, uneven rhythm struggling for life. One surviving T-34 sat crooked in a shallow crater, its hull blackened and dripping with melted frost. The commander lay half-slumped in the open hatch, motionless except for the faint rise of his breath. The engineer helped him down carefully. The commander's eyes were unfocused, reddened from smoke. He looked not at the engineer but through him, as if the battlefield's enormity still filled his vision. Other survivors emerged through the haze, their movements slow and unsure. A handful of tankers stumbled across the snow, faces darkened with soot, uniforms scorched at the edges. Their expressions were hollow, stunned by the speed and precision of what had struck them. They gathered near the remnants of a supply truck, using it as a focal point in the shapeless destruction. The engineers moved among them, counting, checking, searching. No words passed between the men except short, necessary calls for medics or tools. Conversation would have been impossible, not just because of smoke and distance, but because none of them yet had the mental footing to speak. The memory of the attack still pulsed in their skulls, the roar of engines, the tearing blast waves, the vibration of bombs ripping the earth apart under them. A medic kneeled beside a burnt-out tank, brushing away soot to reveal a faint serial marking on the armor. He paused, listening. Somewhere inside, a faint tapping echoed, a trapped crewman signaling through layers of twisted steel. Tools clattered as tankers rushed to pry open the warped hatch. Each clang of metal reverberated through the quiet field with unnatural sharpness. Dawn fully broke while they worked, revealing the full scale of devastation. What had been intended as a breakthrough spearhead was now a landscape of wreckage stretching across the shallow valley. Tracks were carved into the earth in chaotic lines, some ending abruptly at blast craters. Snow had melted in broad swaths where the heat of bombs had scorched the ground black. Turret rings lay far from their vehicles, ripped free by internal detonations. Ammunition boxes lay half-buried, warped by heat. Nothing stood untouched. More survivors arrived from the far edge of the column, some limping, some supporting one another. A few carried portable radios that crackled intermittently with attempts to reach headquarters. The interference was still heavy. Smoke from dozens of burning vehicles climbed straight into the sky, visible for miles, an unintentional beacon announcing the failure of the thrust. The senior engineer gazed across the field, taking in the enormity of what the Germans had accomplished. The Luftwaffe attack had not merely disrupted the advance, it had eradicated its core strength in less than an hour. He had heard rumors from other sections of the front about the new German tactics. Fast armored fighters replacing slower Stukas, precision low-level attacks, timing meant to break formations before they could disperse. But he had not believed they could be executed with such cold, mathematical efficiency. The remnants of the column tried to regroup. Officers gathered near a gutted command vehicle, studying maps burned at the edges. Their gloves left smudges of soot across the paper. Each man looked older than he had that morning. A courier arrived on foot from a rear liaison point, face pale, delivering a brief message: the offensive would be halted. The corridor the tanks were meant to carve would remain closed. The engineer didn't need to hear more. The battlefield said everything. He stepped away from the group and climbed the gentle ridge where the first bombs had fallen. The wind tugged at his coat. Below him, the entire valley lay exposed, still burning in places, still smoking heavily. The sunlight glinted off fragments of shattered armor, making the destruction shimmer as if the field were covered in broken glass. In the distance, snow drifted across the plain in thin, ghost-like sheets that wound through the wrecks like pale ribbons. A dull boom echoed far off, secondary detonation from a cooking-off ammunition rack. The sound rolled across the valley and faded slowly into the cold air. The engineer closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The Soviets had lost battles before, but this was something else, an encounter with a level of precision, speed, and lethality that few on this front had ever witnessed. The Fw-190 strike would be studied, dissected, retold. Command would demand answers. Crews would speak of aircraft that seemed to appear out of the very smoke, cutting entire columns apart in minutes. This battlefield would not be forgotten. As the wind strengthened, carrying the last remnants of smoke eastward, the engineer turned back toward the survivors gathering near the shattered command vehicle. Rescue work would continue. Salvage operations would begin. Reports would be written. But the silence of the field remained, a heavy, lingering presence that would stay with all of them long after the fires died out. And as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the burned snow, the truth of the day settled over the survivors like a final verdict. For the first time, they had seen what a handful of Fw-190s could do to a Soviet armored spearhead. And nothing on that field felt the same again.